Welcome back to Relics of Time, the place where forgotten empires rise again, where the dust of ancient kingdoms is brushed away, and where the voices of history speak once more. If you love stories of powerful rulers, lost civilizations, ancient mysteries, and the men whose decisions shaped the world we live in today, then you are in the right place. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and leave a comment below telling us, which ancient ruler should we uncover next? Because tonight, we travel into the heart of Mesopotamia, to the land of rivers, temples, merchants, priests, and kings, to meet a man whose name survived for nearly 4,000 years. A man remembered not only for conquest, not only for ambition, but for something far more enduring: law. His name was Hammurabi, and though countless kings ruled before him, and countless kingdoms vanished after him, Hammurabi became something else. Not merely a ruler, not merely a conqueror, but a symbol. A king who understood that true power was not held only by the sword, but by the rules that govern the lives of ordinary people. This is the story of Hammurabi, the king of Babylon, the lawgiver of the ancient world, and the man who turned a city into an empire. Long before Hammurabi's name was carved into stone, before his laws echoed through the streets of Babylon, Mesopotamia was a fractured land. A land divided between the great rivers Tigris and Euphrates. Cities rose and fell like waves upon the sea: Larsa, Isin, Eshnunna, Mari, Ashur, Babylon. Each city had its ruler. Each ruler had his ambitions. Each ambition was sharpened by fear. There was no single master of the land. Only alliances that could break overnight. Only treaties written in hope and broken in greed. This was a world where cities fought for water, farmland, trade routes, temple wealth, and prestige before the gods. Because in Mesopotamia, power was never simple. A king was not just a military leader. He was expected to protect irrigation canals. He had to keep trade flowing. He had to satisfy the temples. He had to feed the cities. He had to prove to the people that the gods had chosen him. And if he failed, another king would come, another city would rise, another dynasty would claim divine favor. This was the world into which Hammurabi was born. Not a world of peace, but a world of opportunity. Because in chaos, there is always room for one extraordinary mind. Today, when people hear the name Babylon, they think of greatness, of towering walls, of immense temples, of hanging gardens and legendary wealth, of decadence, mystery, and ancient power. But in Hammurabi's early days, Babylon was not yet the giant it would become. It was important, yes, strategically placed, certainly. A city with promise. But it was not yet the unquestioned master of Mesopotamia. There were stronger rivals, older dynasties, richer cities, more established powers. Babylon was not born on top, and perhaps that is what made its rise so extraordinary. Because history often remembers empires as if they were destined. As if greatness was inevitable. But it never is. Empires are built by decisions. By timing. By patience. By ruthlessness. And above all, by people who see what others cannot. Hammurabi would become exactly that kind of man. Hammurabi became king of Babylon around 1792 BC, during what historians call the Old Babylonian period. He inherited the throne from his father, Sinyabalit, and when he took power, he did not yet rule a vast empire. He ruled a kingdom, but not the kingdom he would later create. At the beginning of his reign, Hammurabi's position was far from secure. He was surrounded by rivals, powerful city-states in the south, ambitious rulers in the north, old regional powers in the east, unpredictable alliances across Mesopotamia. In another age, a weaker king might have rushed into war, might have tried to prove himself immediately, might have chased glory before building stability. But Hammurabi was not careless, and this is one of the first signs of his brilliance. He did not begin as a reckless conqueror. He began as a patient ruler. One of the most dangerous myths about great kings is that they rise through constant battle, that they simply storm across the world, destroying enemies and claiming crowns. But many of history's most dangerous rulers were not the ones who attacked first. They were the ones who waited. And Hammurabi knew how to wait. In the early years of his reign, he focused not on dramatic conquest, But on strengthening Babylon itself, he improved infrastructure, he reinforced administration, he dealt with local governance, he oversaw canals and irrigation systems, he ensured agriculture remained stable, he paid attention to the practical machinery of power. This is important to understand, because a kingdom does not survive on heroism alone. It survives on water, taxation, road, slave, or bureaucracy, loyalty, and Hammurabi understood that before you dominate the world, you must first control the ground beneath your own feet. He was building more than a kingdom. He was building the foundation of an empire. To understand Hammurabi, we must understand the landscape around him. Mesopotamia was not a simple region. It was one of the most advanced parts of the ancient world. Cities here had scribes, temples, archives, strata networks, legal traditions, diplomatic correspondence, skilled artisans, and organized armies. This was not primitive chaos. This was a highly developed civilization, but one constantly threatened by fragmentation. Kings wrote letters. They negotiated marriages. They exchanged gifts. They swore loyalty. They made promises before the gods. And then, they betrayed each other. A treaty in Mesopotamia was sometimes not a guarantee of peace. It was merely a pause before the next war. And Hammurabi learned to move through this world with precision. He understood something many rulers never truly grasped. Power is not only about force. It is about timing. If you strike too early, you lose. If you trust too quickly, you are betrayed. If you appear weak, you are devoured. But if you wait, if you build, if you watch, if you let your enemies exhaust one another, then one day, the entire board opens before you. And when that day came, Hammurabi was ready. Like many rulers of the ancient Near East, Hammurabi did not present himself merely as a political leader. He ruled in a world where kingship was sacred. To govern was not only to command men. It was to act under the watchful eyes of the gods. The people of Mesopotamia believed deeply in divine order. Every city had its patron deity. Temples were not just places of worship. They were economic centers, political centers, cultural centers. Records were stored there. Land was managed there. Priests wielded influence there. A king who ignored the gods was not merely foolish. He was dangerous. And so Hammurabi carefully shaped his image. He portrayed himself as chosen by the gods, protector of justice, guardian of the weak, maintainer of order, defender of proper worship, legitimate ruler of Babylon. This image would later become central to his legacy. Because Hammurabi did not want to be remembered as a tyrant. He wanted to be remembered as a just king, even if justice, in his world, could be harsh beyond modern imagination. In the beginning, Hammurabi's campaigns were cautious. He did not immediately try to swallow all of Mesopotamia whole. Instead, he moved carefully. He watched rival powers. He built alliances. He chose moments of weakness. He exploited divisions. This is what separates a strong king from a legendary one. A strong king can win battles. A legendary king knows which battles not to fight. Yet, for years, Hammurabi strengthened Babylon while other rulers underestimated him. Perhaps they saw him as merely another regional king, another ambitious ruler among many, another player in a crowded field. But beneath that surface, something was changing. Babylon was becoming stronger, richer, better organized, more stable, and Hammurabi was becoming more dangerous with every passing year, because the longer he ruled, the more experience he gained, the more intelligence he gathered, the more alliances he tested, the more he learned where the cracks in Mesopotamia truly lay. He was not rushing toward glory. He was preparing for domination. What kind of man was Hammurabi? That question lingers through history. We do not know his voice. We do not know the exact expression on his face. We do not know what he sounded like when he gave an order, or how he looked when a messenger brought news of rebellion or victory. But from what he left behind, we can infer much. He was disciplined. He was intelligent. He was deeply strategic. He was methodical. He was patient. And perhaps most importantly, he understood human behavior. He understood fear. He understood ambition. He understood loyalty. He understood punishment. He understood symbolism. He knew that armies conquer land, but ideas hold it. He knew that temples legitimize kings, but administration sustains them. He knew that people obey force, but they remember law. And this realization, would one day make him immortal. As the years passed, the political landscape around Babylon shifted. Some rivals weakened, some made mistakes, some fought the wrong enemies, some trusted the wrong allies, and in the ancient world, a single mistake by one king could become the opportunity of a lifetime for another. Hammurabi was watching all of it. He waited as if the world itself were arranging pieces before him. And then, the moment came. The patient king would become the conqueror. The cautious ruler would become the master of Mesopotamia. The builder of foundations would begin to raise the empire itself. But before Hammurabi became the lawgiver history remembers, before his name was carved into stone, before he was celebrated as the king of justice, he first had to prove something far older than law. He had to prove that he could survive in a world ruled by power. And soon, Mesopotamia would learn that Babylon was no longer merely another city. It was becoming the center of a new order. An order shaped by one man. A man whose greatest weapon was not only his army, but his mind. For years, Hammurabi had waited. He had strengthened Babylon. He had watched his rivals. He had learned their habits, their weaknesses, their ambitions. He had studied the fragile web of alliances that bound Mesopotamia together, and the tensions that could tear it apart. He understood something that lesser kings often failed to see. In a world of constant conflict, victory did not always belong to the strongest army. Sometimes, it belonged to the ruler who knew when the world was ready to break, and when that moment came, Hammurabi moved, not wildly, not recklessly, but with the precision of a man who had spent years preparing for exactly this. Because Babylon was no longer merely surviving. It was ready to rise. When Hammurabi first took the throne, Mesopotamia was not dominated by a single master. It was a chessboard of kingdoms. To the south, powerful city-states and old dynasties still carried the weight of ancient prestige. To the east, rulers watched the river valleys and trade routes with suspicion. To the north, other kingdoms and regional powers were growing, negotiating, maneuvering. And beyond all of them, there were shifting coalitions, old grudges, religious loyalties, commercial interests, and military rivalries. No king could afford to think only about war. Every campaign had consequences. If you marched south, the north might betray you. If you attacked one enemy, another might strike your rear. If you weakened your army too much, allies might suddenly become predators. This was the brutal mathematics of ancient Mesopotamian politics. And Hammurabi understood it better than almost anyone. One of Hammurabi's greatest strengths was not just military force. It was timing. He did not begin by charging at the most dangerous enemies. He waited for opportunities. He allowed rival powers to struggle with one another. He observed their wars. He took note of their weaknesses. He saw which rulers overextended themselves, which alliances were fragile, which cities were exhausted, and which kings believed they were safer than they truly were. To many, this may have seemed passive, but it was not. Passivity. It was control, because a ruler who can force his enemy to exhaust himself has already won half the battle before the first soldier even marches. Hammurabi's patience was not hesitation. It was strategy sharpened into a weapon. It is tempting to imagine Hammurabi as a king who simply conquered everything in his path. But history is rarely so simple. Before cities fell, there were letters. Before armies marched, there were negotiations. Before alliances collapsed, there were promises. Mesopotamian kings lived in a world of intense diplomatic communication. They sent envoys. They exchanged gifts. They arranged marriages. They invoked the gods as witnesses to their agreements. And Hammurabi knew how to use this system. He made alliances when they served him. He maintained peace when peace strengthened Babylon. He kept relations stable when direct conflict would be premature. This is what made him so dangerous. He did not treat diplomacy as the opposite of war. He treated diplomacy as one phase of war. A quieter phase. A slower phase. But no less important. Every treaty could buy time. Every alliance could isolate an enemy. Every promise could become a bridge, or a trap. As Babylon's internal strength grew, Hammurabi began to expand his influence more boldly. He secured nearby territories. He strengthened Babylon's control over strategic areas. He extended authority where possible through pressure, through local submission, and when necessary, through force. This was not yet the final storm, but it was the beginning of visible transformation. Babylon was no longer just one city among many. It was becoming a regional power. Its ruler was no longer simply a participant in Mesopotamian politics. He was becoming one of its central architects. Other kings would have noticed this. They would have seen Babylon's growing confidence, its expanding reach, its increasingly stable administration, its ability to mobilize resources. And with that realization, fear would have begun to spread. Because in the ancient world, a rising city was never merely a neighbor. It was a future threat. Mesopotamia's political world was unstable by nature. An ally today could be an enemy tomorrow. A city that paid tribute this year might rebel the next. A ruler who swore loyalty before the gods might betray that oath as soon as the balance shifted. Hammurabi operated in this world with ruthless clarity. He knew that trust had limits. He knew that oaths were powerful, but not permanent. He knew that kings were often loyal only as long as it was useful. And because he understood this, he did not rely on sentiment. He relied on leverage. If an alliance helped him, he kept it. If a treaty bought him time, he used it. If a rival weakened himself, Hammurabi noticed. If a city became vulnerable, Hammurabi moved. This was not cruelty for its own sake. This was survival, and in time, it became dominance. At some point in Hammurabi's reign, the balance of power truly began to shift. Rival states that once appeared formidable were now less secure than before. Some were weakened by conflict. Some were isolated. Some had exhausted themselves in struggles that did not benefit them. Some simply failed to recognize how dangerous Babylon had become. This is often how great transformations happen in history. Not because one king suddenly becomes powerful overnight, but because many others make mistakes at the same time. And Hammurabi was ready to exploit every one of them. He began to act more decisively, more aggressively, more openly. The patient king was changing. The builder of Babylon was becoming the master of war. One of the most significant moments in Hammurabi's rise was his campaign against Larsa. Larsa had long been one of the great powers of southern Mesopotamia. It was wealthy. It was influential. It was not a minor city to be casually dismissed. To defeat Larsa was not simply to win a battle. It was to challenge one of the great centers of regional power, and Hammurabi succeeded. When Larsa fell, the political consequences were enormous. Suddenly, Babylon's position changed dramatically. The south, with its rich agricultural lands, strategic importance, and ancient prestige, was no longer beyond Babylon's reach. This was more than conquest. This was a declaration. A signal to every ruler in Mesopotamia. Babylon was no longer rising. Babylon had arrived. To modernize, it may be tempting to see conquest only in terms of military glory. But for Hammurabi, southern Mesopotamia was valuable for deeply practical reasons. Control of the south meant access to fertile agricultural land, greater control over irrigation systems, influence over old sacred and prestigious cities, increased tax revenue, stronger trade positioning, legitimacy through association with ancient centers of civilization in Mesopotamia. Land was wealth. Water was power. Temples were legitimacy. To rule the south was to claim more than territory. It was to claim history itself. And Hammurabi understood that. He was not merely collecting cities. He was assembling the pieces of a civilization. After major victories, the effect was often psychological as much as military. Some rulers resisted. Others reconsidered. Some cities fought. Others submitted before the walls were ever tested. Because once a king gains momentum in the ancient world, momentum can become a force of its own. Every victory changes the calculations of everyone else. A city asks, can we survive if we resist? A local ruler wonders, will our allies really come? A commander thinks, what if Babylon wins again? Fear spreads faster than armies. And Hammurabi knew how to use reputation as a weapon. He did not need to destroy every enemy completely in the same way. Sometimes the fall of one great rival was enough to make three smaller ones kneel. Among the most fascinating episodes of Hammurabi's array is his relationship with Mari, a major kingdom located along the Euphrates. Mari was not merely another city. It was wealthy, sophisticated, strategically vital, and deeply involved in the diplomatic world of the time. For a period, Hammurabi and Mari had cooperative relations. This reflects a crucial truth. Ancient rulers often worked with those they might later destroy. Friendship between kingdoms was often conditional, useful, temporary, and when circumstances changed, so did loyalties. Eventually, Hammurabi turned against Mari. The city that had once been part of the broader political network he navigated became a target. This is one of the clearest examples of his political realism. He was not guided by permanent affection. He was guided by long-term supremacy. If Mari's existence no longer benefited Babylon, then Mari's independence became a liability. And in the logic of empire, liabilities are removed. To later generations, Hammurabi is often remembered as a lawgiver. A king of justice. A ruler who protected widows, orphans, and the vulnerable. But before he became the symbol of legal order, he was something else. He was a unifier, and unification in the ancient world was rarely gentle. Cities were not asked politely to surrender autonomy forever. Rulers did not give up power because it was morally convincing to do so. They yielded because they had to, because they were defeated, because they were isolated, because they were intimidated, because resistance no longer made sense. The peace that follows conquest is often built on wounds, and Hammurabi's order was no exception. He was creating stability, but stability built through force. He was creating law, but law enforced by power. He was creating unity, but unity born from submission. This does not make his achievements less significant. If anything, it makes them more real. As Hammurabi's campaigns succeeded, Babylon transformed, not only politically, not only militarily, but symbolically. It was becoming the center of a new world. Merchants now dealt under Babylonian authority. Officials carried out orders in Babylon's name. Tribute flowed toward the city. Temples were linked to a growing royal system. Provincial control deepened. The king's reach expanded. And with every passing year, the city that once had to prove itself became the city others had to answer to. This is one of the great shifts of ancient history. Babylon did not become legendary merely because it existed. It became legendary because rulers like Hammurabi transformed it from a city into an idea. An idea of imperial order. An idea of central authority. An idea that power could flow from one throne across many lands. By this stage of his reign, Hammurabi had achieved what many kings only dreamed of. He had survived. He had expanded. He had defeated major rivals. He had elevated Babylon. He had turned a regional kingdom into a dominant power. But he was not finished, because conquest alone does not create immortality. Many kings conquer, many armies burn cities, many empires rise, and many are forgotten. What would make Hammurabi unforgettable was not only what he conquered, but what he wrote. Because once the wars of unification had done their work, once Babylon stood above the lands around it, once Hammurabi had proved he could take power, he would turn to the next question. A question more difficult than war. How do you hold an empire together? How do you govern many cities, many traditions, many classes of people, many disputes, many ambitions, many fears? How do you turn conquest into order? That is where the sword begins to give way to stone, and where the king becomes something more than a conqueror. He becomes a law. By now, Hammurabi had done what many kings spent their lives trying to achieve. He had secured Babylon. He had outmaneuvered rivals. He had broken powerful enemies. He had turned a rising kingdom into the dominant force of Mesopotamia. But conquest alone was never enough, because victory on the battlefield creates opportunity. Not permanence. An army can force cities to kneel. A king can demand tribute. Walls can hold back enemies. But none of these things, by themselves, can guarantee order inside a growing empire. And Hammurabi understood this better than most rulers of the ancient world. If Babylon was to remain strong, its power could not depend only on fear. It needed something else. Something visible. Something permanent. Something that could reach beyond the palace, beyond the battlefield, beyond the moment. It needed law. And so the man who had conquered with patience and precision began shaping the legacy that would outlive his armies. The legacy carved into stone. To modern people, laws often feel ordinary. We are surrounded by rules every day. Rules about contracts, rules about theft, rules about marriage, rules about property, rules about work, rules about injury, rules about inheritance. But in Hammurabi's time, the public display of royal law carried a different kind of power. It was not merely administration. It was a statement, a declaration that the king did not simply rule by force, but by order. In Mesopotamia, legal traditions already existed long before Hammurabi. He was not the first ruler to create laws. That is important to understand. There had been earlier law collections. There had been legal customs in city-states. There had been contracts, judges, scribes, and formal disputes. So Hammurabi did not invent law. What he did was something more powerful. He turned law into monument. He turned justice into royal propaganda. He turned legal authority into a visible symbol of what it meant for Babylon to rule. At the center of Hammurabi's legacy stands one of the most famous artifacts in world history, the Stele of Hammurabi. A tall stone monument. Dark, imposing, covered in writing. At its top is a striking image. Hammurabi stands before a divine figure, often understood as the sun god and god of justice, Shamash. The message is unmistakable. The king is not merely speaking for himself. He is receiving authority, receiving legitimacy, receiving divine sanction. This image matters enormously, because the laws beneath it are not presented as personal opinion. They are presented as part of a sacred order. In other words, Hammurabi is not saying, "These are my preferences." He is saying, "This is justice, endorsed by the gods." And in a deeply religious society, that changes everything. To disobey the law is not only to defy the king. It is to defy the order of the cosmos itself. The Code of Hammurabi is a collection of laws and legal rulings, written in Akkadian cuneiform, covering a wide range of subjects in daily life. It is often said to contain around 282 laws, though the exact numbering in modern editions comes from later scholarly reconstruction. These laws deal with matters such as theft, violence, separity, dispute, estradi, debt, marriage, divorce, inheritance, adoption, slavery, labor, professional responsibility, agriculture, irrigation, false accusations, witness testimony, injury, punishment. In other words, this was not a vague moral code. It was practical, concrete, administrative. It dealt with the messy reality of human life, not just kings and priests, not just war and temples, but merchants, builders, farmers, families, debtors, landowners, craftsmen, servants. This is one of the reasons the code fascinates people even today, because it brings us closer to the ordinary world of ancient Mesopotamia. A world of arguments, contracts, damage, jealousy, mistakes, obligations, and consequences. A world that suddenly feels very human. It is tempting to read Hammurabi's laws as if they were purely about morality, but they were also about control. An empire is made of different people, different cities, different traditions, different local habits. Without a framework, disputes multiply, conflicts escalate, local elites act independently, corruption spreads, authority fragments. Law creates predictability, and predictability strengthens the state. If merchants know how disputes are handled, trade becomes easier. If landowners know the rules of irrigation and damage, agriculture becomes more stable. If families know inheritance structures, wealth transfers more smoothly. If judges know the king's standard, local authority becomes tied to central authority. This is the hidden brilliance of Hammurabi. The code was not just about punishing wrongdoing. It was about creating a Babylonian framework for how society should function. And that meant the king's reach extended far beyond soldiers and tax collectors. It entered the household, the workshop, the field, the marketplace, the marriage contract, the courtroom. Law became a form of empire. No phrase associated with Hammurabi is more famous than this: an eye for an eye. Or more precisely, the principle that punishment should mirror the injury committed. This idea, often called lex talionis, the law of retaliation, is one of the most iconic features of the code. If a man destroyed another man's eye, his own eye could be destroyed. If he broke a bone, his bone could be broken. To modern ears, this sounds brutal, and it was, but in the ancient context, it also represented something important. It placed a limit on vengeance. Without law, injury can spiral. One wound becomes a feud. A feud becomes bloodshed. Bloodshed becomes generational hatred. But if the punishment is fixed, if it is defined, if it is known, then private revenge can, at least in theory, be replaced by formal justice. This is one of the paradoxes of ancient law. What seems savage to us could also be seen, in its own time, as a form of restraint, not mercy, but restraint. And here, we arrive at one of the most important truths about Hammurabi's code. It was not a system of equality in the modern sense, not even close. The punishments and compensations often depended on social status. In the code, society was not treated as a single level field. There were distinctions between free men of higher status, commoners, enslaved people, dependents, different legal and social positions. The same act could lead to different consequences depending on who committed it and who suffered it. For example, injuring a social equal might trigger retaliatory punishment, but injuring someone of lower status could result in a financial payment instead. This is deeply important, because it reminds us that Hammurabi's justice was not based on universal human equality. It was based on order within hierarchy. The goal was not to say that every life was valued identically. The goal was to maintain a structured society where every person had a defined place, and every conflict had a defined response. This is not modern justice. This is ancient statecraft. And yet, despite its harshness and hierarchy, the code repeatedly presents Hammurabi as a protector. In the prologue and epilogue, he describes himself in exalted terms. As a king chosen by the gods. As a ruler who brought righteousness. As one who prevented the strong from oppressing the weak. This language is powerful, because it reveals how Hammurabi wanted to be remembered, not just as a conqueror, not just as a punisher, but as a guardian of justice. He wanted future generations to see him as the man who brought fairness to chaos, and to some degree, this may have reflected real administrative purpose. Laws can protect weaker people in certain situations, especially when they limit arbitrary abuse, clarify rights, and create formal procedures. But we must be careful. This was not modern humanitarian reform. This was royal ideology. The image of the just king was politically useful. It strengthened legitimacy. It linked kingship to morality. It reassured subjects that Babylonian rule was not random. Even when the punishments were severe, the system claimed to be rational. And in politics, a ruler who appears righteous can often command more lasting obedience than one who appears merely cruel. There is no honest way to discuss Hammurabi's code without acknowledging its severity. Many punishments were brutal. Some involved physical retaliation, some involved death, some involved mutilation, some imposed heavy financial penalties, some targeted false witnesses, some punished professional negligence with shocking consequences. For example, one of the most famous laws states that if a builder constructs a house and it collapses, killing the owner, the builder can be put to death. If it kills the owner's son, the builder's son may be killed. This is staggering, not only because of the harshness, but because of how responsibility is imagined. The logic is not purely individual in the modern sense. It is embedded in family, status, and reciprocal consequence. This reveals something profound about the ancient world. Law was not always centered on abstract rights. It was centered on restoring order, balancing loss, deterring carelessness, and preserving hierarchy. The punishments were meant to shock. Warn. Make the cost of disorder unmistakable. One of the most fascinating aspects of Hammurabi's laws is how deeply they reveal ordinary life. Behind every law is a real human problem. A field flooded because someone neglected a canal. A merchant who trusted the wrong business partner. A family arguing over inheritance. A husband accusing a wife. A wife seeking divorce. A doctor whose procedure failed. A laborer hired for wages. A debtor falling into hardship. A person falsely accusing another. A slave trying to escape. A builder whose work was unsound. These are not abstract ideas. They are windows into how people lived, what they feared, what they valued, what could destroy their livelihood, what could damage their honor, what could threaten their family. This is why Hammurabi's code matters so much historically. It is not only the story of a king. It is a record of a civilization's anxieties, its priorities, its social structure, its economic tensions, its moral assumptions, its need for order. This is one of the great questions historians still debate. Was the code used as a literal day-to-day legal manual in exactly the way modern people imagine, or was it also, perhaps primarily, a monumental statement of royal justice? The answer may be both. There is evidence that Mesopotamian courts had legal practices and traditions that were complex and local. Not every dispute would necessarily have been resolved by directly consulting the stele as if it were a modern statute book. Instead, the code may have functioned in multiple ways, as a royal declaration of legal principles, as a model of ideal justice, as a teaching text for scribes, as a symbol of the king's authority, as a public statement of order under Babylonian rule. This actually makes it even more interesting, because the code was not merely a list of rules. It was theater, political theology, state messaging. A performance of justice carved in stone. And Hammurabi understood that symbols can be as powerful as armies, sometimes more powerful. Why did Hammurabi's code survive in memory when so many other rulers faded? Because it captured something unforgettable. It showed a king who did not want to be remembered only for what he destroyed. He wanted to be remembered for what he defined. He gave structure to chaos. He declared what injury meant, what debt meant, what loyalty meant, what responsibility meant, what family meant, what property meant, what punishment meant. He gave answers, harsh answers, unequal answers, ancient answers, but answers nonetheless. And in a world where uncertainty can tear kingdoms apart, certainty becomes power. That is the genius of Hammurabi. He understood that fear can force obedience for a moment, but law can make obedience feel inevitable. This question lingers over his legacy. Was he a genuine reformer? A protector of the weak? A ruler who wanted fairness in a brutal world? Or was he a master strategist who understood that law was simply a more elegant form of control? The answer is probably both. He may have sincerely believed in order, in righteous kingship, in divine duty, in the need to restrain chaos, and at the same time, he absolutely understood the political value of that belief. This is what makes him so compelling. He was not simply a villain, not simply a hero. He was something more historically real. A ruler of immense intelligence, working within the values of his age, using justice, fear, religion, symbolism, and administration to build something larger than himself. And that is why his name still echoes, not because he was gentle, but because he was effective. By the time the code stood before the people, Hammurabi was no longer merely a successful king. He had become a figure of monumental authority. A ruler who had conquered. A ruler who had organized. A ruler who had declared that Babylon's order was not temporary. It was structured, legible, divinely sanctioned, and meant to endure. But even the greatest laws do not write themselves into reality forever. A king may define justice, yet he must still maintain roads, manage provinces, control officials, secure canals, keep tribute flowing, handle unrest, watch borders, respond to crisis. In other words, after the stone came the harder task, living up to it. And in the next part, we step beyond the code itself and into the real machinery of Hammurabi's empire, because the laws made him famous, but administration made his world function. When most people think of great ancient rulers, they think of battles. Of chariots. Of siege walls. Of spears glinting beneath the sun. Of kings standing triumphant over conquered cities. And yes, Hammurabi knew war. He knew ambition. He knew conquest. He knew how to bend rival kingdoms to his will. But conquest, by itself, does not create a lasting civilization. An empire cannot survive on victory alone. Armies can open the gates. They can silence rebellion. They can make subjects kneel. But they cannot, on their own, keep canals flowing, settle land disputes, record taxes, regulate labor, manage temples, maintain roads, oversee trade, preserve grain supplies, judge contracts, supervise officials, and that is where many rulers fail. They win the world, but lose the peace. Hammurabi understood something profound. The true strength of a king is not only measured by what he conquers, but by what still functions after the army has left. And so after the campaigns, after the victories, after the rise of Babylon, came the harder work, the work of making an empire live. Under Hammurabi, Babylon was not simply a city. It was becoming the beating heart of a new political order. A center of authority. A center of administration. A center of religious legitimacy. A center of economic gravity. Orders flowed outward from Babylon. Messages traveled. Records were written. Officials reported. Tribute was collected. Judgments were issued. Resources were allocated. This transformation matters, because when a city becomes the center of empire, it stops being merely local. Its rulers' concerns become regional. Its bureaucracy becomes larger. Its temples gain wider significance. Its scribes become instruments of control. Its walls become symbols of stability. And in Hammurabi's reign, Babylon was learning how to become that kind of city, not simply famous, necessary. If we truly want to understand Hammurabi's world, we must understand one word: water. Mesopotamia was the land between rivers. The Tigris and the Euphrates shaped everything. But rivers alone did not guarantee prosperity. In fact, unmanaged water could be destructive. Flooding could ruin crops. Neglected canals could destroy farmland. Poor irrigation could lead to hunger. Disputes over water could trigger economic crisis. This is why irrigation was not a minor issue. It was a matter of state survival. A king who failed to manage water could lose food, revenue, legitimacy, and social stability. And Hammurabi knew this. He oversaw canal systems. He supported infrastructure. He understood that agriculture depended on careful management. This is reflected even in his laws. There are provisions dealing with negligence in irrigation. If someone failed to maintain a canal and it caused damage to another's field, that person could be held responsible. This tells us something essential. The empire was not only held together by force. It was held together by systems. And one of the most powerful systems of all was the movement of water across land. In a place like Mesopotamia, to control irrigation was to control life. Behind every temple wall, behind every legal decree, behind every royal proclamation, there was grain. Grain fed cities. Grain paid workers. Grain stabilized households. Grain sustained armies. Grain supported temples. Grain could even function as a medium of economic exchange. In ancient Mesopotamia, food was not just food. It was administration. A ruler like Hammurabi had to think constantly about agricultural productivity, harvest, reliability, labor obligation, storage, distribution, taxation, seasonal vulnerability, environmental risk. This is the reality behind imperial grandeur. If the harvest failed, law became harder to enforce. If workers could not be supported, construction slowed. If grain was mismanaged, urban stability weakened. If rural land suffered, the whole kingdom felt it. This is why the image of the king as warrior is only half the story. The other half is the king as manager of survival. And in that role, Hammurabi was deeply engaged. No ancient empire can function without people who can write, and in Mesopotamia, writing was one of the greatest instruments of civilization. Scribes were not merely record keepers. They were custodians of power. They wrote contracts. They recorded taxes. They copied legal texts. They preserved royal decrees. They tracked labor obligations. They documented land arrangements. They managed archives. They supported judges and administrators. Without scribes, an empire becomes forgetful, and a forgetful empire cannot control itself. Under Hammurabi, the written word mattered immensely. This was a civilization where clay tablets carried agreements, obligations, debts, and legal memory. A promise could be inscribed. A transaction could be witnessed. A ruling could be preserved. A law could be copied. This is part of why Hammurabi's code is so important. It was not born into a culture unfamiliar with writing. It emerged from a world where writing already shaped economic and legal life. But Hammurabi elevated that written authority to an unprecedented public monument. And behind that monument stood an entire scribal culture making the empire function every day. As Babylon expanded, Hammurabi could not personally decide every dispute in every town. No ruler could. The larger the realm, the more power must be delegated, and delegation creates risk. Because local officials may be corrupt, judges may be biased, governors may grow too independent, tax collectors may abuse the people, regional authorities may put themselves before the king. This is the eternal problem of empire. How do you rule places you cannot constantly see? Hammurabi's answer was structured. He relied on a network of officials, administrators, and judges who carried out royal authority. The law helped standardize expectations. Written records created accountability. Provincial oversight helped connect the local and the central. This did not eliminate corruption. No ancient system could fully do that. But it created a framework in which local power was meant to remain tied to the king. This is one of the hidden strengths of Hammurabi's reign. He did not only centralize military victory, he tried to centralize governance. And that is much harder. In modern imagination, we often separate religion and government too sharply when we think about the ancient world. In Hammurabi's Babylon, that separation barely existed in the way we understand it. Temples were sacred spaces, but they were also economic institutions. They owned land. They managed resources. They employed people. They stored goods. They participated in redistribution. They carried cultural authority. They shaped legitimacy. A king who ignored temples would be a fool. A king who challenged them carelessly could undermine his own position. A king who aligned himself with divine order, however, could strengthen his rule enormously. This is why Hammurabi's image before Shamash matters so much. He was not merely saying, "I have laws." He was saying, "The gods recognize my right to define order." And in a civilization where divine favor was politically essential, that was priceless. Religion did not sit outside the empire. It was woven into its foundation. One of the most fascinating things about Hammurabi's laws is that they reveal how deeply the state cared about the household. Marriage, inheritance, adoption, divorce, dowries, family obligations, children, servants, property within the home. These were not private matters in the modern sense. They were social and economic matters with political consequences. A stable household meant stable inheritance. Stable inheritance meant predictable property transfer. Predictable property transfer meant less conflict. Less conflict meant less disruption to social order. This is why ancient law often enters the most intimate spaces, not because rulers were curious about private life, but because private life was part of public stability. A marriage contract was not merely romantic. It was economic. An inheritance dispute was not merely emotional. It was political. A household in crisis could become a legal problem, a social problem, an economic problem, and Hammurabi's state wanted those problems defined, named, managed. Babylon's power was not built only on fields and conquest. It was also built on movement of goods, movement of people, movement of obligations, movement of wealth. Mesopotamia was connected through trade networks. Merchants moved products, materials, and value across regions. Contracts governed partnerships. Loans were made. Debts accumulated. Risk existed everywhere. And Hammurabi's laws reflect this. There are rules about commercial relationships, debt, agency, liability, and property. This matters because it shows that Babylonian rule was not only agricultural and military. It was commercial. A king who wants a strong state needs more than loyal farmers. He needs functioning exchange. He needs merchants who know the rules. He needs contracts that can be enforced. He needs enough predictability that people are willing to engage in trade. The law becomes part of the marketplace. And when the marketplace trusts the law, the state grows stronger. Ancient economies were harsh. Crop failures happened. Floods happened. Illness happened. Debt accumulated. Families could fall into desperate situations. In Mesopotamia, debt was not an abstract financial inconvenience. It could transform lives. A person in debt might lose property. A household might lose stability. Dependence could be pledged. Labor obligations could intensify. This is why debt appears so often in ancient legal systems. It was one of the great pressure points of society. Too much disorder around debt could destroy trust, productivity, and social cohesion. Hammurabi's laws addressed these issues, not because the world was compassionate in a modern sense, but because uncontrolled economic collapse is dangerous for a kingdom. Even when certain protections existed, they existed within hierarchy. The system did not abolish inequality. It regulated it, and that distinction is everything. A law is not only a rule. It is a message. It tells people what matters, what is forbidden, what will be protected, what will be punished. In Hammurabi's empire, Punishment was not only about the individual offender. It was public theater. A severe penalty warned others. A visible consequence created memory. A known standard discouraged private chaos. This is why ancient punishments can feel so extreme. They were meant to communicate, not only to the guilty, but to everyone watching. The state was saying, this is what happens when order is broken. This is what happens when trust is violated. This is what happens when carelessness destroys life. This is what happens when the structure of society is threatened. And once again, we see Hammurabi's deeper logic. Law was not separate from power. Law was power, made visible. It is easy to admire order from a distance. A unified empire. A famous legal code. A powerful capital. A disciplined administration. But order always has a cost. Some people paid in taxes. Some paid in labor. Some paid in obedience. Some paid in fear. Some paid in bodily punishment. Some paid with their freedom. Some paid with their lives. That does not erase Hammurabi's brilliance, but it prevents us from romanticizing him too easily. He was not building a gentle world. He was building a functioning one. By the standards of his age. And in the ancient world, function often mattered more than mercy. That is uncomfortable. But it is also historically honest. Many rulers conquered land. Many ruled cities. Many issued decrees. But Hammurabi's reign feels different because he combined so many forms of authority at once. He was a conqueror, an administrator, a legal architect, a religiously legitimized ruler, a strategist of symbolism, a manager of agriculture, a coordinator of bureaucracy, a maker of order. This is why his name survived. Not simply because he was powerful, but because he turned power into a system. And systems outlast moments. A battle ends. A victory fades. A city can fall, but a structured way of ruling can echo for generations. At the height of Hammurabi's reign, Babylon stood as the dominant force of Mesopotamia. Its king had defeated rivals. Its authority stretched across important lands. Its administration functioned through records, officials, and local structures. Its laws projected order. Its religious imagery reinforced legitimacy. Its agriculture supported survival. Its trade supported wealth. From the outside, this may have seemed like permanence, like destiny, like the triumph of a ruler who had solved the ancient problem of chaos. But history rarely grants permanence, not even to the greatest kings, and beneath the surface of every empire lies a question that cannot be avoided. What happens when the man who built it is no longer there? Because even the strongest system can be tested by succession. And in the next part, we will step into the twilight of Hammurabi's life, toward legacy, toward decline, toward the truth that even kings who write laws in stone cannot write themselves out of mortality. There is a moment in every great ruler's life that no army can defeat. No law can prevent it. No priest can delay it forever. No wall can keep it outside the gates. It is the moment when power begins to loosen its grip. Not because the ruler becomes weak overnight. Not because enemies suddenly appear from nowhere. Not because the kingdom immediately collapses. But because time, quietly and without mercy, begins to ask a terrible question: what remains when the man is gone? For Hammurabi, this question may have been more dangerous than any battlefield, because he had not merely ruled Babylon. He had shaped it, expanded it, disciplined it, defined it, organized it, legitimized it. He had taken a rising kingdom and turned it into the central power of Mesopotamia. But empires built by extraordinary men often carry a hidden weakness. They can become too dependent in the mind that created them. And so, as Hammurabi moved into the final years of his reign, the great issue was no longer simply conquest. It was continuity. The exact emotional texture of Hammurabi's final years is lost to us. History rarely preserves the private silences of kings. We do not know the tone of his voice in old age. We do not know whether he trusted his heirs completely. We do not know whether he felt satisfaction, anxiety, or both. We do not know whether he believed his work was secure. But we can infer the pressure surrounding him. He had spent decades building something vast. He had subdued rivals. He had strengthened Babylon. He had presented himself as the guardian of justice. He had woven law, religion, administration, and royal power into one political identity. And now, like all rulers, He faced the oldest uncertainty in statecraft: succession. A kingdom can survive hardship. It can survive war. It can survive famine, rebellion, or invasion. But a weak succession can unravel everything. Because the death of a strong ruler does not merely remove a person. It removes a center of gravity. While a great king lives, many tensions remain contained. Local elites obey, governors hesitate to rebel, subject cities stay cautious. Officials perform their duties more carefully, enemies wait, allies remain respectful. Why? Because the ruler's presence itself is part of the system. His reputation matters, his history matters, his victories matter, his fear matters, his symbolic authority matters. But once he dies, everything changes. Every ambitious subordinate begins to calculate. Every border becomes more vulnerable. Every subject people asks, "Must we still obey?" Every rival asks, "Is this the moment?" This is the cruel paradox of empire. The stronger the founder, the more difficult it can be for successors to match him, and the more difficult it becomes to keep the structure equally stable. After Hammurabi's death, his son Samsu-Iluna inherited the throne. And what he inherited was not simply a kingdom. He inherited expectations. He inherited enemies not fully extinguished. He inherited conquered territories that may have obeyed more out of fear than loyalty. He inherited a vast political system that required constant attention. He inherited the shadow of one of the greatest rulers of the age. This is one of the hardest inheritances in history. To rule not after a failure, but after greatness. Because when a mediocre ruler follows chaos, even small success looks impressive. But when a ruler follows brilliance, even competence can look like disappointment. And the challenges came quickly. During the reign of Samsu-Iluna, parts of Hammurabi's empire began to slip away. Rebellions occurred. Regional control weakened. Some formerly subdued territories reasserted themselves. The cohesion that Hammurabi had created proved difficult to preserve in full. This does not mean everything collapsed instantly. That is too simple. But it does mean something very important. The empire was less permanent than it had seemed. This is one of the most fascinating historical questions. Did Hammurabi create a system strong enough to outlive him? Or did he create a system that, despite its sophistication, still depended too heavily on his personal authority? The answer is likely somewhere in between. He absolutely created institutions. He used administration. He used written law. He used bureaucracy. He used regional governance. He used religion as legitimacy. He used economic regulation and legal order. These were not the tools of a careless conqueror. But institutions in the ancient world were often more fragile than they appeared. A system may look stable while the founder is alive. Yet after his death, it may reveal how much depended on personal charisma, military reputation, direct oversight, fear of royal retaliation, the founder's ability to mediate competing interests. This is not a failure unique to Hammurabi. It is one of the oldest patterns in human history. A brilliant founder creates order. Successors inherit structure, but not always the force of personality that made the structure obeyed, and then the cracks begin, slowly, then faster. When we look backward at ancient empires, we often imagine them as solid blocks of history. We picture neat maps, clear borders, stable control, unbroken dominance. But ancient political reality was rarely that simple. Control could be layered. Allegiance could be conditional. Submission could be temporary. Peace could be strategic. Loyalty could vanish the moment pressure weakened. This is why Hammurabi's empire must be understood carefully. At its height, it was powerful. It was impressive. It was historically transformative. But it was not immortal. No ancient empire was. And this matters because it changes how we understand greatness. Greatness is not always permanence. Sometimes greatness is intensity. Sometimes greatness is what one ruler achieves in a single lifetime, even if later generations cannot fully hold it together. Hammurabi may not have created an eternal empire, but he created a reign that altered the political imagination of Mesopotamia. And that is a different kind of immortality. Babylon did not disappear with Hammurabi. That is crucial. Even though his empire weakened after his death, the city of Babylon remained historically important. In fact, over the centuries, Babylon would rise again and again in memory, symbolism, and political significance. It would become one of the most famous cities in the ancient world. Its name would echo through Mesopotamia in history, biblical tradition, classical writing, archaeology, modern imagination, later kings, later dynasties, later empires, all would inherit the shadow of Babylon. And that means Hammurabi's achievement was not erased. Even if the exact political structure he built did not remain intact forever, he helped elevate Babylon into something far greater than a regional city. He helped place it on the stage of world history. That alone is extraordinary. Here is one of history's most beautiful ironies. Cities can burn, palaces can collapse, dynasties can fail, borders can vanish, armies can be forgotten, and yet, words can survive, especially when they are carved into stone. Hammurabi's laws endured in memory not because every clause ruled every generation forever, but because the act itself was monumental. He made law visible. He made kingship moralized. He made authority speak in the language of justice. He made political power claim divine legitimacy through public order. This is why the stele matters so deeply. It is not just a legal document. It is a declaration. A declaration that a ruler's greatness could be expressed not only in conquest, but in the ordering of human life. That is why modern people still say his name. Not because they remember all his wars, not because they know every city he subdued, but because the image of Hammurabi the lawgiver proved stronger than the image of Hammurabi the conqueror, and that image crossed millennia. For centuries, the ancient world lay buried, cities sank into dust, empires became mounds, royal names faded into silence. Then archaeology changed everything. In the modern era, the discovery of ancient Mesopotamian inscriptions and monuments allowed lost civilizations to speak again, and among the most dramatic rediscoveries was the famous stele of Hammurabi's laws, found far from Babylon itself. Carried away in antiquity as war booty, the monument emerged as one of the great treasures of the ancient Near East. Suddenly, the old king returned, not in flesh, not in empire, not in military force, but in text. In carved symbols. In formal language. In a vision of justice from nearly 4,000 years ago. This rediscovery transformed Hammurabi from a name known mainly to specialists into one of the most recognizable rulers of the ancient world. Students learned about him. Museums displayed him. Books discussed him. Documentaries featured him. Teachers invoked him as an early symbol of law. In a strange way, he won a second life. This is where history asks us to be precise. Popular culture often presents Hammurabi as if he invented law. That is not true. Long before Hammurabi, Mesopotamian societies already had legal traditions, contracts, court practices, customary rules, and earlier law collections. He did not create justice from nothing. He inherited a legal civilization. But what he did was something equally important. He elevated and monumentalized the king's role as the public guarantor of order. He turned legal ideology into royal theater. He made the king appear not merely as a judge among many, but as the divinely sanctioned protector of the vulnerable and punisher of disorder. So if Hammurabi was not the first lawgiver, why does he feel like one? Because he was one of the most successful at turning law into legacy. And now we reveal the deepest truth about him. Hammurabi is easy to admire, and difficult to simplify. He spoke of justice, yet many punishments were brutal. He claimed to protect the weak, yet his society remained profoundly unequal. He created order, yet that order rested on hierarchy, fear, and harsh enforcement. He built institutions, yet the empire weakened after his death. He sought permanence, yet time reduced his kingdom, while preserving only fragments. This contradiction does not diminish him. It makes him real, because real rulers are not myths. They are mixtures, vision and violence, structure and fragility, justice and power, mercy in some places, severity in others. To understand Hammurabi honestly is to resist the temptation to turn him into a saint or a monster. He was either. He was something more historically interesting, a profoundly capable ancient king who understood that order could be built, displayed, enforced, and remembered, and he did it better than almost anyone of his age. Why do we still return to Hammurabi? Why does a king from nearly 4,000 years ago still matter? Because he stands at the crossroads of questions that never disappear. Questions like, What is justice? Who gets protected by law? Who gets punished more harshly? Is law truly equal for all people? Can power claim morality without becoming oppressive? Does order require fear? Can a state be stable without hierarchy? How much of justice is principle, and how much is politics? These are not dead questions. They are living questions, and that is why Hammurabi remains modern in an unsettling way. Not because his answers are ours, but because his world reveals how ancient. In the end, Hammurabi's greatest victory may not have been territorial. It may not have been military. It may not even have been legal in the narrow sense. His greatest victory was memory. He became unforgettable. Not fully understood by everyone, not always interpreted correctly, not free from myth, not free from simplification, but unforgettable. His empire shrank. His dynasty struggled. His political moment passed. Yet his name endured. Across clay, across stone, across scholarship, across classrooms, across museums, across documentaries, across the imagination of anyone who has ever asked where law, power, and civilization begin to meet. And in that sense, Hammurabi achieved what few rulers ever do. He outlived his own age. Before we leave Hammurabi behind, before the stone grows silent again, before Babylon fades back into dust and legend, we must do one final thing. We must step away from the throne, away from the royal court, away from the monument, away from the polished image of the king receiving authority from the gods. And we must ask a different question. Not, what did Hammurabi want the world to see, but, what did it feel like to live inside that world? Because history is too often told from the top of palaces, from the voice of kings, from inscriptions, from monuments, from victories carved in stone. But real life is not lived in monuments. It is lived in houses. In workshops. In fields. In temple courtyards. In dusty roads. In family disputes. In market stalls. In grain storage rooms. In borrowed silver. In promises made on clay tablets. In fear of flood. In fear of debt. In fear of punishment. In hope for harvest. In prayers whispered at dawn. And if we want to understand Hammurabi completely, we must imagine not only the king, but the people beneath him. Imagine the sun rising over Babylon, not the Babylon of later legend alone, but the living city of Hammurabi's age. The air is already warming. The streets are not silent for long. A laborer wakes before the heat intensifies. A merchant reviews goods and accounts. A scribe prepares clay and stylus. A woman manages household work and family obligations. A temple servant begins ritual duties. A farmer thinks of water, soil, and timing. A debtor thinks of repayment. A father worries about inheritance. A widow worries about security. A builder thinks of wages. A judge anticipates disputes. A servant waits for commands. A child sees only the day ahead. This is the truth of ancient civilization. Even in the reign of a great king, most people do not spend their days thinking about empire. They think about survival. They think about food, about work, about status, about obligations, about family, about danger, about reputation, about what happens if something goes wrong. And in Hammurabi's world, many things could go wrong. To modern minds, a law code can feel distant. A historical artifact. A museum object. A list of rules from a vanished age. But to people living in Hammurabi's Babylon, law was not abstract. It could enter your marriage. It could define your contract. It could determine your wages. It could shape your inheritance. It could decide the outcome of your dispute. It could punish your negligence. It could regulate your debt. It could affect your household. It could protect you in some cases. It could crush you in others. Law was not a book on a shelf. It was a force in the air, not always visible, not always equally applied, not always fair in the way we would define fairness, but real, and feared. This is one reason Hammurabi matters so much, because he reminds us that law, from its earliest monumental expressions, has always carried a double nature. It can protect, and it can threaten. It can stabilize, and it can control. It can promise justice, and it can reveal inequality. That was true then. It is still true now. One of the hardest truths in Hammurabi's world is that not all people stood equally before consequences. Status mattered deeply. The law often distinguished between different categories of people. The penalty for harming one person might differ from the penalty for harming another. Compensation could depend on rank. Social worth was not measured equally. To modern ears, this feels fundamentally unjust. And it is important to say that plainly. Hammurabi's world was not built on the idea that every human being possessed equal legal standing in the way many modern societies aspire to. It was hierarchical, structured, layered, unequal by design. But that does not make it meaningless to study. In fact, it makes it more revealing, because it shows us that ancient law was never only about moral ideals. It was also about preserving a social order. A very specific social order. Point 1, in which different people carry different value in the eyes of the state. That truth is uncomfortable, but it is also essential. When we speak about women in ancient Mesopotamia, we must avoid two mistakes. The first mistake is imagining total freedom. The second is imagining total invisibility. The truth, as usual, is more complex. Women in Hammurabi's Babylon could appear in legal matters. They could be involved in marriage contracts. They could hold certain forms of property or dowry rights. They could be protected under specific legal conditions. Widows, wives, daughters, priestesses, each could occupy very different social and legal positions. But none of this means equality in a modern sense. Patriarchal structures were powerful. Family control was significant. Marriage was economic as much as personal. Honor, lineage, fertility, and inheritance all shaped women's lives. The household was one of the most important arenas of law, and because the household mattered so much to social stability, women's roles within it mattered enormously. This is why women appear in the legal record, not because the society was egalitarian, but because the household was too important for the state to ignore. That tension is part of what makes ancient Mesopotamia so compelling. Women were not absent from the system. They were embedded within it, sometimes protected, sometimes constrained, often both at once. No honest telling of Hammurabi's world can avoid this. Slavery existed. So did various forms of dependency, bonded labor, and constrained status. Human beings could be treated as property or as deeply subordinated persons within economic and legal systems that accepted hierarchy as normal. Some people were born into lesser status. Some fell into it through debt. Some entered it through war or sale. Some lived in forms of servitude that were legally recognized and socially embedded. This is one of the darkest aspects of the ancient world, and it must not be softened. The civilization that gave us monumental law, urban administration, advanced writing, and durable political memory, also accepted profound inequality in human freedom. That contradiction is not unique to Babylon. But Babylon makes it visible, and if we are serious about history, we do not only admire the achievements, we also face the cost. If there was one unit more important than the individual in Hammurabi's world, it was the family. Family determined identity. Family determined inheritance. Family determined continuity. Family determined obligation. Family determined social standing. Family determined vulnerability. This is why legal attention to family was so intense. Marriage contracts mattered. Dowries mattered. Children mattered. Adoption mattered. Inheritance mattered. The status of wives, sons, daughters, widows, and dependents mattered. Because the family was not merely emotional. It was structural. If families functioned, society functioned more predictably. If inheritance was clear, property disputes could be reduced. If marriage obligations were formalized, economic relationships became more stable. This is another lesson of Hammurabi's age. Ancient states often entered intimate life not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. What happened inside the home could. Modern people often want civilization to sound comforting. We like to imagine progress as safety. But in the ancient world, civilization could also mean surveillance, obligation, punishment, and discipline. It meant being known by authorities. It meant being subject to contracts. It meant owing labor or payment. It meant being judged. It meant being measured against expected roles. And it often meant fear. Fear of failing to repay debt. Fear of legal accusation. Fear of punishment. Fear of public shame. Fear of economic ruin. Fear of losing status. Fear of displeasing superiors. Fear of flood. fear of drought, fear of war, fear of the gods. This does not mean life was only terror. There was joy too. There was family. There were festivals. There was trade. There was music. There was prayer. There was craft. There was laughter. There was hope. But stability in ancient states was often maintained not only by shared belief, but by structured consequences. And Hammurabi understood that very well. For the people of Babylon, the world was never merely political. It was sacred. The gods were not distant philosophical abstractions. They were active presences in the imagination of daily life. Storms could be signs. Victory could be divine favor. Disaster could be divine anger. Fertility could be blessing. Illness could carry spiritual meaning. Oaths mattered because the gods could witness them. Temples mattered because they linked earth and heaven. In this world, a king who claimed divine backing was not making a symbolic flourish. He was speaking the language of reality as people understood it. And this is why Hammurabi's connection to Shamash was so powerful. Shamash, associated with the sun, justice, and truth, was the perfect divine patron for a king who wanted to present himself as the guardian of lawful order. It was brilliant political theology, and it worked, because in a sacred universe, law did not need only force. It needed cosmic meaning. So why does this world still haunt us? Why does Mesopotamia, and figures like Hammurabi, still feel foundational? Because so much begins here. Not everything, never everything, but so much: urban life on a grand scale, written administration, legal formalization, statecraft, imperial ambition, recorded contracts, monumental kingship, public claims of justice, bureaucratic memory, the fusion of religion and power. When later civilizations looked back, whether directly or indirectly, they were looking at one of the earliest laboratories of organized human complexity, and Babylon became one of its most enduring symbols, not because it was perfect, but because it was early, powerful, literate, ambitious, and unforgettable. There comes a point when a historical figure stops being only a person. He becomes a symbol. That happened to Hammurabi long ago. He became the king of law, the judge of antiquity, the ruler with the stone, the image of order carved in black basalt, the face of early civilization in classrooms and documentaries, the name people invoke when they ask where law begins. And yet, the real Hammurabi was more than the symbol. He was more complicated, more strategic, more human, more severe, more intelligent, more limited, more revealing. To reduce him only to the first lawgiver is too simple. To dismiss him as merely brutalis also too simple. He belongs to that difficult category shared by many great rulers of history, a man whose achievements are undeniable, and whose world forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. When we look at Hammurabi, we are not only looking at one king. We are looking at a threshold. A threshold where power becomes system, rule becomes record, justice becomes public ideology, religion becomes state legitimacy, administration becomes memory, law becomes performance, civilization becomes both shelter and control. This is why he matters. Because he helps us see that civilization is not only made of beauty. It is made of rules. Of hierarchy. Of fear. Of labor. Of writing. Of ritual. Of ambition. Of enforcement. And sometimes of a single ruler determined to turn chaos into something that can be named. If you stood in Babylon under Hammurabi, and looked up at the temples, the officials, the walls, the marketplaces, the tablets, the canals, the households, the soldiers, the judges, the merchants, the workers, the priests, you might not think first of greatness. You might think first of pressure. Of responsibility. Of order. Of danger. Of expectation. Of divine presence. Of human inequality. Of survival within a structure larger than yourself. And yet, from that structure emerged one of the most enduring names in human history. A king who understood something ancient and terrifyingly modern, that if you can define order, if you can make that order visible, if you can persuade people that heaven itself approves it, then your rule may survive long after your body is gone. Hammurabi's kingdom did not last forever. His dynasty did not remain supreme. His empire was not immortal. But his name was. And perhaps that is the final lesson of Babylon. Stone breaks, cities fall, empires weaken, dynasties vanish. But ideas, especially ideas carved into power, can cross thousands of years. And so, as the sun sets over ancient Babylon, as the dust settles over the roads once walked by scribes, soldiers, merchants, and kings, as the black stone of law stands silent beneath the weight of centuries, we leave Hammurabi where history has left him, not as a myth, not as a saint, not as a monster, but as one of the first great masters of organized power. A ruler who understood that law could be more than judgment. It could be image. It could be control. It could be legitimacy. It could be memory. And in learning his story, we do not only discover the ancient world. We discover something about ourselves. Because the questions that haunted Babylon still haunt us now. Who makes the rules? Who benefits from them? Who suffers under them? What is justice? And how much of civilization is built on order, and how much on fear? If you made it all the way to the end, thank you for being here with me on this journey through one of the most powerful stories of the ancient world. Welcome to the world of forgotten kings, buried empires, and voices that still echo through time. This is Relics of Time. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment telling me, do you see Hammurabi as a bringer of justice? Or as a master of control? Thank you for watching. And until next time, keep searching the ruins of the past. Because history never truly disappears. It only waits to be remembered.